Those about to die on Peacock. No, that doesn't sound right. Let's try once again. Those About to Die, a fantasy TV show, was released on Peacock, which is a streaming service, and Amazon Prime, and I'm gonna analyze some of its most prominent and most outrageous aspects. First of all, what we're dealing with, and is it any good? It's a TV series about ancient Rome. 10 episodes set in the time of the Flavian dynasty, or more precisely, it starts in the year 79 and ends roughly in September of 81, I guess, when Domitian becomes the new emperor. It is focused on gladiatorial combat and surprisingly on chariot racing, and also delves into politics because it was conceived as a direct answer to the House of the Dragon. No, Titus doesn't fight in the arena as a gladiator, which is absolutely bizarre. The show stars Anthony Hopkins as Vespasian, but he spends, I guess, less than 15 minutes on screen in total. Ivan Reon, Ramsay Bolton from the Game of Thrones, is more or less the main star here. Everything was filmed in Rome at Cinecittà and relies heavily on CGI, and local Italian actors and models as well. Naturally, the show is quite bad, but not absolutely atrocious. Yes, it is awful from the historical perspective, it has broken world building and has a traditional cannibalistic message of Rome bad, burning babies alive good, but it becomes watchable after 2 or 3 episodes, and in fact it is better than 70% of pseudo-historical trash set in ancient Rome, because the bar was set quite low. Now I'm gonna comment on some of the main problems with Those About to Die. The list is not exhaustive, obviously, just the most important stuff. The video is divided into big sections like gladiatorial combat, slavery, Titus and Domitian, etc. Because it is easier to structure the information this way. And I'm gonna finish with some minor stuff that deserves mentioning. It must be noted that I've amassed a sizable amount of videos on 2 of my channels discussing certain aspects that are relevant to our current subject. So I will mention certain videos, if you want to dig a little bit deeper, and provide a whole list of links in the description. Those About to Die and gladiatorial combat. Let's start with the name of the TV show. It is inspired by this 1958 book written by Daniel P. Mannix, and the name makes perfect sense from the marketing perspective. The phrase, "those who are about to die salute you," penetrated mass culture and frequently perceived as a customary gladiatorial salute, which is not true. It's a phrase found in Suetonius and Cassius Dio, and it refers to one particular episode. A naval battle reenactment staged in the times of Claudius. The participants were condemned criminals, they were not professional gladiators. And this is where I have to address the depiction of gladiatorial combat in mass culture and in movies in particular. I do it quite frequently, and if you've ever watched my previous videos, you will say that at this point I sound like a broken record. But if you never watched my videos before, there is no accurate, even remotely accurate depiction of gladiatorial combat in movies. All of them operate with a weird, outdated concept which gained traction and became insanely popular. This depiction of Roman games shouldn't be tolerated because, first of all, it's ridiculous on at least several different levels, and second, it portrays ancient Rome as a society of degenerates, which is incorrect and extremely offensive. Some people might say that it is entertaining and it is not a big deal since ancient Romans are long dead. No, you're missing the point. It is a huge deal. And I can spend several hours explaining why. In short, there is this thing called Spanish Black Legend, when the enemies of Spain were actively engaging in demonizing it, twisting and inventing the facts, falsifying history, etc. All because they had their own political and religious agenda. The original Black Legend is the Black Legend of Rome. And it is a Black Legend told about your parents, about your cultural ancestors. Gladiatorial combat is a prominent piece in this anti-Roman propaganda, a piece composed by religious fanatics who knew nothing about professional sports. Every time someone advances this idea that gladiators were killing each other on purpose in the arena, and also people paid money to watch mass executions and stuff like that. Well, the people who advanced these ideas should be mercilessly ridiculed. This kind of depiction of ancient games shouldn't be normalized. When somebody tells you that football is the game when the two teams kick the severed head and the losing team is executed, you either laugh out loud or you think that this person knows nothing about football and is probably insane. When somebody tells you that baseball is the game where participants beat each other to the pulp using baseball bats, and it is a valid illustration that explains how degenerate is the society where people pay money to watch this, indeed, it tells you a thing or two about the people who came up with this demented propaganda at some point. The closest analogy of Roman gladiatorial combat is American professional wrestling. That's it. Circus Maximus and factions. Thus About to Die is focused on both gladiatorial combat and chariot races. Actually, it is more focused on chariot races, which is a good thing. I mean, the whole idea of going into ancient racing with all these teams, team shareholders, betting, etc., it is fundamentally a good and quite fresh idea. Filmmakers rarely do this. A show where professional chariot racing is one of the primary subjects, it is a fantastic thing. Well, if it is done properly. In the case of Those About to Die, it is sometimes done properly, but most of the time it is not. But at least thank you for the effort. Chariot racing and factions is a very interesting and very complex subject. You don't really have that many sources, you can't properly reconstruct the system. And most of the time, all of the discussions of the researchers tend to shift to the later period of Roman history, late antiquity and beyond, the factions of Constantinople. Because that's where we have more information, even though the sources for this period are quite horrible and you can't understand what was really going on. It is the period where two factions, the Blues and the Greens, became actual political parties with their own pocket armies, ideology and religion. They could stage a full-scale riot, advance their own candidates for the emperor and so on. This is where you can introduce interesting theories, and some people do. For example, there were researchers who advanced the idea that militarized medieval Islamic youth organizations in Syria and Iran, Futuwa organizations, who did a number of things and reportedly served as some sort of urban militia. So there is a theory that, in fact, they were direct descendants of the factions of the Hippodrome in Constantinople and the eastern part of the empire in general. You can also venture into territories adjacent to conspiracy theories. Some people do it as well. And speculate that the green flag of Islam was actually borrowed from... Anyway, we're in the 1st century, so there is no Constantinople. But the factions were a thing and they had fanatical supporters. We don't know how all of this functioned, but we have a general idea. So yes, there were 4 main factions/teams at the time of Vespasian. And yes, Suetonius mentions that Domitian introduced 2 new teams, purple and gold. But they didn't last for long. The show is quite accurate in this aspect. You can create a good story around that. The problems are, they are numerous. First of all, these 4 teams operated not only in Rome, and in fact they were quite large corporations. The show discusses the idea that there were shareholders and they are struggling with each other for control. That's good, but the teams were significantly larger and much more important enterprises compared to what we see in the TV show. And it kind of spoils everything. We don't know the structure of shareholders, but it is unlikely that you'd have an actual consul as a majority shareholder, publicly demonstrating to everybody that he's the principal owner. Actually, this kind of arrangement that Domitian and Tenax had in regards to the GOAT team is more believable. Traditionally, the teams were run by the people from the equestrian class, not the senatorial class, although they most certainly had patrons among senators. The teams and their fans were a big thing, not only as business enterprises, it was also a political question. So this is where we have a problem when Formula One teams or, top-tier NASCAR teams are depicted as if they were small-town teams competing in some amateur league of dirt track stock car racing. The TV show features stories like, one team essentially stole the chariot from the constructor and repainted it. Then we have these random guys who brought horses from Spain the other day, but these horse breeders are also quite good at racing. I mean, it's all nice stories and they advance the plot, but these are not stories about Circus Maximus in Rome and its wealthy teams competing at the highest level. It is a story about chariot racing in a small town. The actual Roman teams had their branches all around the empire. They were well funded. They had supply chains for delivering the best horses. They employed a lot of people. They had constructors. They had scouts. They had training facilities. They had everything. Also, you don't get to Formula One by showing up at the doorstep of a Ferrari team principal and telling him that you're really good at driving cars. But they are doing exactly that in the TV show. That's just absurd. But I have to mention that the episode with sandbagging a chariot is a nice touch. Something comparable is happening every now and then, even in Formula One. Teams were disqualified over that. The main star of all this racing subplot is a character called Scorpus, who is theoretically based on a real-life chariot driver of the same name, a record-breaking chariot driver. The prototype lived a little bit later and raced for a different team. There is an interesting and funny episode when Scorpus from the TV series suddenly mentions the god Elagabalus for no reason. Probably that's how the showrunners wanted to show that the character was from Syria and was very multicultural. But given that historical Scorpus was racing for the green team, the screenwriters could have combined this little fact with this idea of Elagabalus worship and produced a nice Easter egg. I mean, Elagabalus was a solar deity personified in a black stone who demanded circumcision from his followers and also required to abstain from pork. Okay, enough of the racing in Circus Maximus, let's move on. But first, a little bit of shameless self-promotion. I have released a game called Oedipus / Antigone. It is a visual novel adaptation of the Theban cycle of Sophocles, Oedipus the King, Oedipus at Colonus and Antigone. It is a visual novel. A visual novel is a genre of games when you're basically reading an illustrated story. You have the English translation by Richard Jebb, you have the original text in ancient Greek for reference, and you have illustrations. All of the characters in the game are represented as marble sculptures, usually quite damaged sculptures. The choice of this particular style was absolutely conscious, and one of the main ideas was to evoke a certain feeling. This is pretty much how objects of material culture from classical antiquity came down to us. And this is how we frequently perceive classical antiquity. Obviously, I'm perfectly aware of the fact that the Theban plays of Sophocles are included in the curriculum in universities and high schools. So I want to provide a healthy alternative to just reading a book or to listening to an audiobook. And for people who already read Sophocles, it might be just a reasonably unconventional way of adapting the material and an interesting excuse to reread the tragedies. The link to the Steam page is in the description. If you want to support this channel, now you know the way. Thank you. Vespasian and Anecdotes. Vespasian, played by Anthony Hopkins, is famous, among other things, for being a character of several very famous and reasonably funny anecdotes. And the showrunners jump on this opportunity and incorporate them into the screenplay when they can. Which is good because at least they read these anecdotes in Suetonius or Cassius Dio. Or maybe they read them from the book Those About to Die or something. Because the interpretation of these anecdotes is sometimes bizarre. One of the reasons why I'm mentioning this and going into the details is because it perfectly illustrates a prominent problem of how you can misunderstand the primary sources and the context. First, we have this flashback with money doesn't smell, which is somehow presented as if Vespasian thought that it doesn't matter how you procure money. Well, the actual meaning is more like there is nothing wrong with the taxation of the public urinals, and there is no need to complicate things when there is absolutely no grounds for it. Also, it is one of these anecdotes that presents Vespasian as a comically stingy person, but in a somewhat adorable way, like he was self-conscious about his character trait and liked to play along. We don't know if it was actually true, because, for example, the accounts of Suetonius are the accounts of a person whose family supported the Flavians during the Civil War. So his Vespasian is a part-time stand-up comedian. And the fact that he was stingy is funny and adorable, while the stinginess of Galba, one of his predecessors, is a horrible flaw of the character. But the more hostile interpretation of the anecdotes is the episode with the death of Vespasian, which combines two separate stories into one. Vespasian had two famous last words. And one was that an emperor ought to die standing, and the other, I think I'm becoming a god. The first one is, well, it is quite straightforward, but it must be understood and even emphasized that imperator means more or less commander-in-chief, and Vespasian was a military man and probably even a war hero. So yes, when the old general asks to lift him up so that he may die standing like a warrior, that's not some stupid vanity as it kind of presented in the TV show. And the way how I think I'm becoming a god is delivered is outright wrong. Yes, Vespasian knew that upon his death, he's going to be officially deified by the Senate. This I think I'm becoming a god was a joke. That's the whole point of the story, that Vespasian was cracking jokes as he was dying. He was making fun of his own death. Titus and Domitian. A bulk of the TV series is dedicated to this struggle between Titus and Domitian about the succession. Since it is not a documentary, you can introduce a plotline with rivalry between Titus and Domitian. It is a bit strange, but you can speculate for the sake of the story. It is not inherently dumb, like this idea that Commodus killed Marcus Aurelius, which was prominently featured in The Fall of the Roman Empire and its unofficial remake, Gladiator. Seriously, there is a difference. Titus Domitian might be a stretch, but you can build something plausible around it. And Commodus killing Marcus Aurelius to become the emperor is just nonsense, especially since he was already the emperor for some time. There could be a rivalry between Titus and his brother, but the question of who's gonna succeed wasn't really on the cards. Titus was already the emperor in all but name. Politically, Vespasian and Titus were more or less the same person. Vespasian was growing old and frail, and naturally he transferred a significant part of his responsibilities to his successor. He didn't come up with the idea that there could be two parallel emperors. That was the invention of Marcus Aurelius. They also discuss, if I'm not mistaken, that for the first time since Augustus, there's going to be a transfer of power from father to son. And I don't really know what they're talking about. Legally, biologically, if biologically, then this transfer from Vespasian to Titus was actually the first time it happened, which is, as always, a separate and quite interesting subject, which kind of, once again, proves that the Roman Empire was essentially an elective monarchy, disguised as a republic, obviously. In order to create some tension and depth to this imaginary struggle between two brothers, the screenwriters invent quite a lot of inaccurate and illogical things. For example, Titus has a mistress. She's not a concubine, as far as I get. Concubine is the official status. So he has Berenice, the Judean queen, because of course he has. She became some sort of a romantic hero over the centuries, and indeed she's mentioned in the sources. Mostly in Josephus, who is universally loved by Christian historians and Christians in general. They practically consider Josephus a Christian writer, because he kind of was a Christian writer. Conspiracy theory. Well, modern Jews love him as well, because they have no choice. There is no ancient Jewish history without Josephus. Anyway, Titus and Berenice discuss things like Titus should marry some actual Roman for political reasons. And he does. He gets married to his cousin. That's all incredibly stupid, especially considering the story of actual historical Titus, who was married twice. None of his wives was his relative. He had a daughter, and now he hasn't remarried during his reign. Instead of inventing this unnecessary stuff, the screenwriters could actually, create a subplot of something about Titus fighting in the arena, because he was fighting in the arena. And I fully expected that a movie about gladiators set in the time of Flavians would jump on this opportunity. It is very logical, but no. Writers don't read the sources and probably don't use consultants. They completely ignored this. They probably think that the first emperor to fight in the arena was Commodus, because Ridley Scott's Gladiator says so. I have to mention that for some reason Titus has a beard. He was a Greek, I guess. Overall, Titus, who is pretty much universally loved by ancient historians, is portrayed in a much less enthusiastic fashion, which I kind of like. But then again, we have Domitian, who is 50% of the time is an interesting character, and the other 50% is an evil caricature. Yes, there is an old tradition of demonizing Domitian. It comes from Roman historiography and then gets poisoned by Christian sources, because Christians think that Domitian didn't like Christians. Well, sure. He didn't like Muslims as well, and he also persecuted Mormons, like a lot. Domitian represents the political wing of Vespasian's administration. He's always scheming and plotting and does speech writing. I mean, there is a hilarious scene where Domitian composes a speech for Vespasian and goes like, "The mules my father and my grandfather bred." Vespasian's grandfather, one of their grandfathers, was probably a centurion. His father was doing tax farming and amassed quite a lot of money. Vespasian initially was coming mostly from an equestrian background. Oh, I think I know where the screenwriters get this idea of mules. They probably think that equestrian class means that the members of this social group were breeding horses or something. No, it was a class directly below senators. But yes, there's this anecdote that when somebody at the court reported that he found some ancient people of importance in the family tree of Vespasian, the emperor was like, "Come on, stop this, I am from the village." But breeding mules? Also, some of the characters occasionally go like, even plebeians like us can achieve something, especially considering that the emperor now is plebeian himself. Please, somebody tell screenwriters and teachers at schools that this dichotomy of plebeians and patricians wasn't really a thing during the imperial period. Anyway, Domitian, who in reality was a very, very competent emperor, although he allowed to get himself killed eventually. He's the main bad guy, and he prefers boys to girls. Which, given the current political climate in Hollywood, means that he's supposed to be a very, very positive character. I don't know what the showrunners are implying and why they portray one of the protected minorities as villains. We should sign a petition and cancel them immediately. Slavery. As always, the screenwriters have a very strange idea of slavery in ancient Rome and probably of slavery in general. They also like to pretend that there is no such thing as laws. By the way, are there any movies when they show paperwork associated with the purchase of slaves? Why do writers think that you can grab a person off the street and declare them a slave? Why do they think that making somebody free is, here's the door, go away? They literally start with this series of insane scenes where their North African family gets enslaved, which, first of all, portrays Romans as total savages, and second, ignores pretty much everything like laws and, yes, paperwork. Given the lack of paperwork, I think that instead of trying to collect money to buy the kids out of slavery or visiting the Vestals, the mother could just go and consult the lawyers. Fortunately, there were hundreds of them around the corner, building the Colosseum. I should cut this joke out during editing. But yeah, the movie tells us that you can actually buy someone out of slavery. It is a fantastic idea that screenwriters usually can't even imagine. We're very close to another fantastic idea that if you want to buy someone out of slavery, you don't need to travel all the way to Rome. Maybe they will find out that, for example, ancient Greeks had a habit of selling people enslaved as a result of a military conflict to their relatives. It really simplifies the logistics of the process. You don't need to transfer anyone anywhere. You can wait around the corner until the locals bring you the money. But in any case, it is a wonderful step in the right direction. I think in 20 years we will see a movie that will tell us that, you know, slaves in Rome could buy themselves out of slavery and you have to pay the taxes to the government. Although we don't know how they calculated the tax. Was it based on the price that was paid to the owner? Or was it some average market rate? Slaves also could buy slaves. Can we make a movie about a slave owned by a slave? Apart from all that, we obviously see and hear the whole package of cliches, including my favorite, that you can do anything you want to your slave, which is simply not true. Slaves also could sue their masters, and quite successfully. We also know about the precedents when slaves sued their masters over the question of manumission. Literally, you have no right to set me free. I want to remain a slave and you'll keep feeding me because I have nowhere to go and I'm unemployable. Why are you turning me into a bum and a beggar? The problem here is not only that the screenwriters obviously never thought about anything like that, but also that the mass audience never thinks about things like that either. Everyone is fed this idea that, you know, there was slavery in ancient Rome, slavery is bad, breaking news. And therefore, ancient Rome was a bad place and Romans were cruel slave owners. The truth is more nuanced, and the main thing here is that ancient Rome had the most progressive and most humane system of slavery of its time. Slavery was everywhere, in every society. And the type of slavery they had in Rome was regulated by well-thought laws and was far less brutal than in any other territory of the world. Romans also knew that slavery is not always effective. In fact, it is wildly ineffective most of the time. So there was a lot of upward mobility, and when it was possible, they tried to switch to more beneficial patron-client relations. Which leads us to another trope exhibited in Those About to Die. The Colosseum is being built by Jewish slaves. Because we all know that ancient Jewish slaves also built pyramids and stuff. I mean, yeah, there is this traditional legend of Jewish slaves building something colossal. And Titus naturally brought a lot of slaves from Judea as a result of his violent anti-Semitic military campaign. Well, the construction works in Rome were performed by specialists and construction firms. Slavery, once again, is not as effective as some people think. Most of the time, it is stunningly ineffective. If you're building a house, you want specialists. You don't want unskilled and basically unpaid labor. Otherwise, pretty soon, the roof will fall on your head. Romans knew that. And here comes another anecdote about Vespasian. When some guy invented a device that could be operated by a couple of people and lift something heavy during construction, Vespasian was absolutely against using it. Because if you use it, that means you need less people. But his goal was to create more jobs at the construction projects, not less. Just like many politicians, he obviously was concerned with creating more jobs. And now we have Hollywood screenwriters who go like, look, Jewish slaves are building the Colosseum. This is disgusting. Diverse people of diversity. Unfortunately, I couldn't spot any Chinese or Native American characters, so we have to agree that this TV show is not diverse enough. But we have black people because slavery. Although we can stretch the definition of black as far as we want. We can even construct a case that black characters in Those About to Die are not really black. Anyway, the series prominently depicts a North African family which has a dark skin pigmentation. There is a question of why this family is black, if North Africans are definitely not. And the screenwriters actually provide some kind of an answer. It is mentioned that the late husband of Kala, the matriarch of the family, was from Nubia. Okay, so that means their children are supposed to be mixed race, and some of them actually are. Some of them. Plus, there is no explanation why a North African matriarch is played by an actress originally from Cabo Verde. Here we have this problem when people who actively promote diversity think in broad categories. They don't care much about promoting actual diversity. They only think about promoting a handful of protected minority groups, usually at the expense of everybody else. So it is usually quite apparent that Hollywood filmmakers think that all black people look the same. No, they don't. They are very diverse anthropologically and culturally as well. Although, once again, it depends on your definition of the word black. Which leads us to a situation when we have a strange family where nobody looks related to each other. It is a bit like if the filmmakers decide to portray a white family from Poland, and it will include an Arab from Morocco, a Hungarian, a Norwegian, a Greek, and a Japanese. They all have a relatively pale skin pigmentation, so let's call them white Europeans and call it a day. It is more complicated than that. There are different anthropological types. We also have an interesting linguistic problem. The matriarch of the North African family is naturally a strong female character. The character is actually quite compelling and most of the time believable, but the screenwriters are frequently overdoing it. No, seriously, she doesn't have to be fluent in all of the languages of the world, especially since your native language is gibberish. No, seriously, the showrunners apparently invented some fictional Numidian language. And Numidians, again, weren't black, but they were North Africans. So you could base language on some Berber dialect, I guess. That's an easy solution. And also we have lesbian gladiators. No, seriously. Yeah, female gladiators were a thing. Lesbians were a thing as well, but You can be absolutely sure that the showrunners had a checklist of things and they tried to squeeze some quite unnecessary stuff into the narrative. This particular plotline of lesbian gladiators happens out of nowhere and without any logic, just because the writers thought that, well, there are still empty checkboxes in the checklist. Vestals. It is good that the showrunners are aware of the fact that being a Vestal was a very privileged position and Vestals had quite a lot of power. And yes, they technically could pardon a criminal condemned to death. But at the same time, the screenwriters do at least a couple of unforgivable things. For example, we see an executed Vestal, her hanging corpse covered in blood, exhibited for public display. That's mental. That's blasphemy. The Vestals were sacrosanct. You couldn't kill a Vestal. That's why if a Vestal was condemned to death, she was transported to an underground vault with some food, where she was supposed to die without any bloodshed and outside violence. Everyone understood it was very cruel, so frequently it wasn't enforced. Although Domitian actually enforced this traditional ritual to the outrage of the general public. Not enforced in this context means that a Vestal was supposed to kill herself. The cruelty of this process is usually hugely exaggerated, especially by Christians, which is kind of funny. First of all, you had one job. And second, Vestals were not puny, powerless, and disenfranchised Christian nuns. They were wealthy, independent, subordinate only to the Pontifex Maximus, meaning the emperor, living saints. Which means that these dialogues of the Vestal Cornelia with her mother sound invented for the whole purpose of toying with the feminist or pseudo-feminist agenda. Like the Vestal is incredibly unhappy with the fact that her family sent her off at the age of 7. She never asked for it, and now she is angry at her mother. How could you do this to your child? Etc. I mean, technically, it is remotely plausible. People might regret things as time goes by, but this is a very heavy-handed and absolutely uncalled for attempt to create some kind of drama. This trope of, oh, poor Vestals, nobody asked their opinion and now they can't sleep with men. Like, what the hell, seriously? From the point of feminism, the Vestals were actually the most empowered of all the women in Rome. They all were legally independent. Financially independent, owned luxurious villas, and actually, after retiring at the age of 37 or something, they could get married if they wanted to. Being a Vestal was a huge privilege and huge honor for her and her family. Names. The names in the TV series are quite weird and sometimes practically random. Strange names for Numidians, strange names for these Spaniards who are, I don't know who they are, Celto-Iberians or something. And obviously, occasionally bizarre names for Romans. You can theoretically forgive these Domitian Flavianus things, but it gets worse. For example, there's a consul named Marcus Servilius. What is his first name, prenomen? Marcus can't really be his first name because it is not a first name. If his daughter is named Cornelia, does it mean that his full name is Marcus Cornelius Servilius? If Marcus is his nomen, then why does his daughter go by Cornelia? I mean, we can spend some time discussing this aspect and advancing theories, but it makes no sense because screenwriters just don't know how the Roman names work, plain and simple. Is it a big deal? Yes, it kind of is. If you're writing a historical drama, make it believable. If you're making a historical drama about the French Revolution, you can't really have a character named Johnson Napoleon, Duke of Beijing. Because if you do have this character, then we're dealing with a surrealist farce comedy. Minor aspects. Now let's go through some small things that don't deserve a separate section of the video, but need to be addressed. Vesuvius. The eruption of Vesuvius covers Rome in ash, and it's all very dramatic and sudden. Well, it was quite sudden for the people of Herculaneum, but not for the people of Pompeii, and not for the people of Rome, which is 250 kilometers from Vesuvius. It all feels like, okay, this is the year 79, we have a great opportunity to showcase this eruption. But they do it very clumsily and forget about it after like 5 minutes. Crucifixions. I'm really glad that the show doesn't put much stress on crucifixion of everyone and everything, but they couldn't abstain from this trope altogether. So yes, they show crucifixions a little bit. Crucifixions on an actual gigantic cross, which is a very exotic and quite impossible method of punishment that exists only in fiction. Clothes. It is great that the showrunners don't depict Rome as a society where everybody is dressed in togas, but sometimes they are overdoing this, and people frequently are not wearing togas on very formal occasions when they absolutely must wear a formal type of dress, a toga. You probably can go into details if you're an expert in ancient Roman fashion and discuss certain inconsistencies here and there, because there's quite a lot of them. But at least thanks for the effort. The production team knows that tunic was the default garment. They tried to enhance it and add more vibrant colors and stuff. Too vibrant colors. No, it's not very accurate, but at least it is better than usual. Military outfits are questionable as well. Of course they are. Statues. You don't see many plain marble statues, which is okay. Basically, you see only busts of the emperors and gigantic statues in Circus Maximus. None of them are painted, but at least they don't feel wrong with like all of it, with monochromatic sculptures. Some of the busts are probably weird, but I'm not in the mood to play a hidden object game. I mean, in every movie set in ancient Rome, you usually can spot some weird busts of the emperors. Like, I remember in this old Julius Caesar movie with Marlon Brando, there was a bust of Emperor Hadrian. And there was Otto in Gladiator. Which is technically not anachronistic, but it is a ridiculous choice for the study of an emperor in the 2nd century. In those about today, I think I spotted a bust of what appears to be a bust of Caracalla, Roman salute. Yes, they have some variation of a Roman salute. Actually, more than one variation. Anthony Hopkins apparently refused to perform Nazi gestures, so he does his own thing. Other characters do their own variations. Yes, Romans could greet somebody using their hands, but using greetings based on this infamous Roman salute is probably not a good idea, because it is not historical. It was essentially invented by Gabriele D'Annunzio for the 1914 movie Cabiria. Praetorians. There is a strange plotline involving Praetorian guards, which theoretically could be transformed into something plausible, but it mostly goes with this stereotype of how unbelievably corrupt they were. So the screenwriters basically borrow some anecdotes from the year of the 5 emperors, year 193, and transport it to the year 81. I don't think that's a good idea. Public construction works. The show pays too much attention to the public construction works. The Flavian amphitheater promises to build public baths, etc. Yes, it was an important aspect, but once again, they're overdoing it and blowing up to absolutely comical proportions. Titus holds a funeral speech for his father, and immediately, literally, his 2nd phrase is about construction. He mentions amphitheater, and with his 3rd phrase, he switches to aqueducts and baths. Domitian announces the death of Titus, and, well, immediately, like 10 seconds into his speech, proceeds to discussions over the proceeds from the Flavian amphitheater. This is madness. Okay, time to wrap everything up. As you might expect, through all of the TV series, through all of the 10 episodes, goes this common thread of Romans enslave and pillage everything. Rome is rotten, its tyranny should be overthrown, they're colonizing someone, etc. Traditional stuff. You think lawless barbarians who lived in tiny villages and had no culture to speak of were better? No, they were much worse. Some of them, like Celts, also practiced human sacrifices, by the way. You think Carthage was better? And some of the main characters are from the territories that belonged to Carthage. Well, Carthaginians were an interesting kind of people. A kind of people who burned their firstborn children alive as a sacrifice to their god. That was actually one of the problems Romans had with them, why Romans were so repulsed by them. You can literally see in those about to die how Celt and the Carthaginian/Numidian are discussing how great it would be if they could just kill all the Romans. I get their sentiment, but it is a sentiment of a hostile savage. And when filmmakers state that the most advanced and humane culture of its time was in fact far worse than lawless barbarians with their human sacrifices, I get this sentiment as well. It is a sentiment of a hostile savage. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to check links to other videos in the description. Give this video 5 stars, subscribe and stuff. And see you soon.